whether Rahm Emanuel was correct in saying that 1 trillion was the absolute maximum that could be asked for. But that's above my pay grade. I don't count votes in the House and the Senate. Why is it important to know this? Well, once again, it's very important indeed if you're Christina Romer, and if it's December of 2008. It is once again less important if you are you. But once again, you may well wind up in jobs that require that you forecast, or at least you ascertain whether forecasts handed to you make sense. And you all will be citizens, will vote, will sit in judgment on the politicians you elect. And one purpose of this class is indeed global citizenship, to try to make you informed voters and informed consumers of political rhetoric, on the grounds that that's essential for all of us over the long run. Now, suppose that we're not just worried about fiscal policy, that we're worried about monetary and banking policy or about other aspects of the situation. Then we're going to want to take this investment savings form of the income expenditure model and take account of the fact that the long-term real interest rate over here is the sum of 4 components, only the first of which is really under the control of the Federal Reserve, and the other components of which are much more psychological. And the fact they're much more psychological is why politicians are always tempted to say prosperity is just around the corner in an attempt to get these things to move in the right direction, or the direction they want, which they sometimes do and which they sometimes do not. And on the final, we're going to ask you to talk about these 4 determinants of the long-term risky real interest rate. Expected inflation, the short-term nominal interest rate the Fed controls, the term premium, the amount by which people expect the Federal Reserve to raise or lower the interest rates it controls over the next several years, and the risk premium, how much people want to have safe assets in their portfolios rather than accept risk and take on risky assets. Fortunately for you as students, unfortunately for you as citizens, unfortunately for me and us as economists, we don't really have good intermediate macro-level models of the determinants of these other components. That is, we do know that expected inflation rates shift, but arguing over what policies could shift expected inflation tends to get absolutely nowhere, as economists argue, and there certainly are no good models I can write down and make you solve for how changes in policy now change expected inflation over the long term, or even over the short term. We have a model of the term premium by which you simply calculate what the term premium is by figuring out what the Federal Reserve tends to do, and then you forecast the economy forward, and once you forecast the economy forward, you forecast forward the Federal Reserve's path of nominal interest rates, and then the term premium is simply the average change in nominal interest rates over the next 5 or 10 years. And I thought about spending a day teaching that. The problem is it really doesn't work very well. It's a nice theoretical model. It does fracking little in terms of actually explaining the world. So we wave our hands and talk about how the term premium is high when people expect the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. And we really have very little purchase on the risk premium at all. Indeed, a major research topic in economics right now is trying to figure out to what extent the Federal Reserve's actions since November aimed at affecting the risk premium have in fact managed to do so. But I'm going to ask you to remember what this equation here is for the determinants of the long-term risky real interest rate and to blather about it. I'm also going to ask you to understand that these are the components of baseline autonomous spending, of this A0 term that comes in front of the policy terms of the income expenditure model. And this is a whole bunch of different and complicated things, right? This is consumer confidence, how much money consumers are spending not because they have incomes, but simply because they are exhilarated or depressed about the future. This is business investor confidence, what the baseline level of business investment spending would be if interest rates were 0, simply because of the state of what John Maynard Keynes called the animal spirits of business investors. Are companies' investment committees optimistic or pessimistic? There's demand for exports, which is pretty much a straight proportion of the level of GDP abroad. If GDP abroad booms, then we have more demand for our exports, and that goes into baseline autonomous spending. There is financial speculator confidence in the currency. If people become more confident in our currency, then our exports are going to shift. And then there's the response. Then there's the response of the exchange rate to the level of interest rates abroad. And then, because that changes the exchange rate, that's going to change the level of baseline autonomous spending. Had things gone in a different direction this spring, if we now were really, really worried about financial crisis and state bankruptcy in Europe, or if weird things were going on in China or with China's renminbi support policy, then we would be definitely worrying about these last equation, these last components of autonomous spending. I'd be making you do exercises with them on the final. We're going to go in a different direction for the rest of the course. We're going to go into U.S. government budget land. And so you'll have to know what this equation is and be willing to wave at it as it goes by. But that's about all. We're not going to ask you to do detailed manipulations with this if, say, the People's Bank of China changes its renminbi support program and so stops putting its money where its mouth is and saying we have enormous confidence in the future value of the dollar. We're just not going to go there. We just don't have time. And the kinds of questions we're likely to ask will be predominantly about the effects of the financial crisis, which you can see here with this spike of the long-term real risky interest rate on junk bond level assets, up from a 6% real interest rate in the mid-2000s all the way up to its peak of nearly 15% at the end of 2008. That's what led to the forecasts of a $400 billion shortfall in investment spending. Simply that change to the long-term risky real interest rate. You hit that with the investment, with its effect on investment and its effect on exports, and you get a deep recession. Actually, it's too bad that even though we didn't get our $400 billion a year fiscal stimulus, we only got about a $200 billion a year fiscal stimulus. We also didn't have our $600 billion fall in real GDP. We had a $1 trillion fall in real GDP. The estimates of the Obama administration at the end of 2008 were an underestimate of the magnitude of the problem. And one interesting thing about this graph is the economy is still depressed. The unemployment rate's still 8.9% right now, instead of the 5% or so that it was in the mid-2000s. Why is the economy still so depressed, given that long-term risky real interest rates aren't that much higher than they were back in 2005, 2006, 2007? Wouldn't the investment savings equation say, hey, wait a minute, interest rates are about back to where they were before, how come the economy isn't? And the answer is precisely that these particular models I'm making you use are very crude and static toys. Right? That all kinds of things in the economy are moving, keep moving, and stay moving. What appears to be the big difference between now and then is that this period that this period really led both households and also businesses to become a lot less confident. So that the magnitude of the downturn then in itself pushed down consumer confidence and also business investment animal spirits. And the depressed nature of both of those things is the reason why the unemployment rate is still up at 8.9%, even though asset prices and returns look like they've come back largely to where they should be. And that's why we have, say, a low-level near equilibrium, that even though asset prices and returns are back to where they used to be, there appears to be no pressure on employment to return the employed share of the American labor for the American adults to anything like its kind of normal levels. And indeed, the unemployment rate has fallen over the past year. But the unemployment rate has fallen not because more people have gotten jobs, but because a lot more people have simply given up looking, have decided they're going to drop out of the labor force and go do something else. This graph plots the employment to population ratio and also the share of adults who either have jobs or are looking for jobs who are in the labor force. And I subtracted 5% in order to make the scales kind of work right, because I forgot that in this graphing program I could put a different scale on the right-hand side and use that to keep the red and the blue lines kind of in the same range, in much the same range. Okay, so that's depression economics. That's what we did on the first midterm. That's the thing where the performance of the bottom third of the class alarmed me and made me cancel the second midterm and turn it into a take-home and schedule this class instead. Although, as I said, as best as I can see, this isn't quite the target group that I wanted to have. There's also the review of growth economics, where we have 5 equations to know. Right? We have the production function for the economy as a whole, output as a function of the capital stock, this amount of useful buildings and tools, raised to this power alpha, and then the efficiency of labor times the labor force, raised to this power 1 minus alpha. Those things multiplied together, that gets you the level of real output in the economy. Why do we write down this little algebraic expression? Because it's much more convenient than writing down a huge big table about how if the capital stock is 60 trillion and if there are 100 million workers, we expect that in 2008 the level of production will be X. It's simply trying to find an easy way to write down a simple model that about corresponds to the empirical reality that we see out there in the real world. Not that this is in any sense true. Right? This is an attempt to approximate a very complicated and messy reality. But the hope is, as economist Herbert Simon used to say, that if you construct the best analysis of an oversimplified situation, you'll have an okay analysis of the complicated world if your oversimplified situation captures the important pieces of the complicated world. And I think this does. Right? This equation does, because it tells us that production rises when the capital stock rises, but that it doesn't rise point for point as the capital stock rises. That a 1 percentage point increase in production produces only an alpha percentage point increase in the level of real GDP. It tells us that if we double the labor and the capital stock in the economy at any one time, we're going to double production, which is a good thing to have, because if we simply duplicated the United States economy in a new continent someplace, you'd hope it would produce twice as much. And it conveniently captures the dependence of growth on the efficiency of labor and the value of our technologies and organizations. More important, I think, than the production function is the per worker production function. This thing that rewrites the production function so that on the left-hand side is production per worker, and on the right-hand side is the efficiency of labor and the capital labor ratio. Simply because most of the time we're interested not in how big economies are, but in how prosperous they are, and output per worker is a much better sense of how prosperous they are than total production. Most important of all, however, for the growth economics we're going to be doing is the balanced growth version of the Solow growth model, in which we have output per worker on the left-hand side, in which we have the determinants of the capital output ratio, the savings rate divided by the sum of the population growth rate, the depreciation growth rate, and the efficiency of labor growth rate in the denominator. All of them raised to this alpha over 1 minus alpha power, which means that for an alpha of 1/2, we're going to have this whole thing vanish because it's simply 1. It means for an alpha of 2/3, we're going to have this 2, a 2 there. We're simply going to take the capital output ratio and square it. For an alpha of 1/3, we're going to have this equal to 1/2, which means we're going to be taking the square root of the capital output ratio in order to determine output per worker. Economists squabble over whether 1/3, 1/2, or 2/3 is best for alpha, and thus for whether 1/2, 1, or 2 is best for this exponent. I tend to be on the 2 side because that's what my reading of the cross-country over time growth evidence suggests to me. Most other economists are on the 1/2 side for this alpha over 1 minus alpha, simply because they say that what alpha really ought to be the share of income that goes to owners of property. And in the United States today, about 1/3 of income goes to owners of property. And on our side, we say that there are a bunch of plausible reasons why that might be an underestimate and stick to our 2/3 guns. That's why I usually find myself writing down an alpha of 1/2 or 2/3 when I write down problems, and that's what you should expect. And especially when alpha is 2/3, this term up here is going to be a square, which means that relatively small differences in savings rates divided by population, depreciation, and efficiency of labor growth rates can produce big differences in relative prosperities. Then you multiply all of that by the efficiency of labor, and you can know and forecast what output per worker is. For forecasting, you're going to want to know what compound growth is, because there are going to be lots of times when you're going to have to calculate the efficiency of labor at some time in the future, and you really should know the rule of 72. You really should know the rule of 72, because it makes a bunch of calculations when things are either growing exponentially or converging to some long-run value a lot easier if your head, if you have that at your tools. Indeed, I was talking to our professor Jim Powell about a month ago when I ran into him in the Free Speech Movement Cafe, I think it was, about how I've been trying to teach you the rule of 72, and he clapped me on the back and said, excellent, that was the best thing he'd ever learned, and it was the secret to part of his intellectual success, that he had that drummed into his brain when he was a junior. And the person who taught it to him was Dan McFadden, and Dan McFadden had never taught him anything more important or more useful, at which point my jaw dropped because Dan McFadden is one of our Nobel Prize winners, and Jim Powell is one of his students. I thought Jim would say that there were other much more sophisticated things that would be incomprehensible to me about the statistical properties of econometrics that McFadden would have taught Powell that he thought were the most useful. But no, right? The single most useful thing, important thing Jim Powell thinks he learned from Dan McFadden is the rule of 72. And Powell said he learned it in the economics department equivalent of this course. Although I don't think it was here at Berkeley. I forget where Powell went to school. So that comes at least highly recommended by the people who teach our econometrics courses in the economics department. So these are the questions we're going to ask you to answer. From the equation that is our balanced growth solution to the Solow growth model. Suppose the efficiency of labor is $10,000 per year, and we have our parameters for our savings rate, our population growth rate, our depreciation growth rate, and an alpha of 2/3, so that capital is really important in producing economic prosperity. What then is y over L going to be? That's a question that you're going to see on the final with some changed parameters and possibly gussied up inside and hidden inside a paragraph of words. So you're going to have to pick out from the paragraph of words that that's what the question really is. But that's a question that we're going to be asking. And yes, 60%. That's excellent. Yes, we have for this equation, we have savings requirements or investment requirements in the economy of 0.10. By the time you add up all these things that use up your savings, a savings rate of 0.2, so 2 divided by 0.10 is 2. 2/3 divided by 1/3 up here in the exponent is 2. 2 squared is 4. Output per worker is 4 times the efficiency of labor. 4 times $10,000 a year gives us an output per worker level of $40,000 a year for this equation. Why is it important? Why is it important that you know how to do this? And here I can't call back to Christy Romer or to Gary Bernstein or any of the people working in the Obama administration. What I can do is call back to the early winter of 1993 when, let's see, my wife Anne-Marie was pregnant with our second child. It was winter. We were living in greater Boston, Massachusetts. All the other economists in the whole wide world, it seemed, had gone to sunny Los Angeles in early January for the American Economic Association annual meeting. And back here in the days before laptops, I was sitting there kind of playing with a toddler, and I get a phone call from Los Angeles, and on the phone is Alan Blinder, now Princeton professor, but sometime vice chair of the Federal Reserve and member of the Council of Economic Advisors for Macroeconomics in Bill Clinton's first term, saying, Brad, you have a computer. We don't have computers out here in Los Angeles. Right? And this was back in the days before laptops roamed the earth in any serious way. The people didn't carry their laptops with them, and so they couldn't do virtually any kinds of complicated calculations. But what Alan wanted to do was to make the case to President-elect Clinton that it was worthwhile taking steps in his first year in policy in order to raise taxes, in order to diminish the federal deficit, in order to mean that the federal government would no longer be borrowing so much money from the private sector, which would leave more money for businesses to borrow from the private sector, which would boost our national savings rate S, and thus boost our capital output ratio, and thus boost our level of output per worker in the long run when we got to our balanced growth path. And he wanted numbers on how large the effects of different policies were likely to be, and he wanted them immediately. And so I set to work and produced a whole bunch of numbers. And they were sufficiently convincing that Bill Clinton spent his entire first 8 months in office trying to raise taxes and reduce government spending in order to boost the national savings rate and create a more prosperous America, according to this growth theory equation. And indeed, I think it worked quite well. The late 1990s were quite a prosperous time. If only we continued those policies of government surpluses into the 2000s, we'd be in much better and stronger shape now. And it's certainly not Bill Clinton's fault or Alan Blinder's or mine that we haven't. But, unless you're going to go work in the White House or for the International Monetary Fund admonishing the White House for being stupid, once again, this is going to be useful to you mostly through one of two areas. The first is that a bunch of you in your jobs will have to evaluate projections of what the future is going to be like. And if ever you're looking at a long-term future, not at the next 5 years, but out at something 20 years from now, you're going to probably want to go to this growth equation or to this growth model in order to understand it. And second, once again, informed citizens, informed consumers of economic policy rhetoric, informed voters. And I think this is especially important because we are, over the next generation, really going to have three big sets of debates, all of which turn in one way or another on issues of long-run economic growth and its pace. Debates about economic development, debates about government budgeting, debates about dealing with global warming. And you can understand the arguments that are going to be being made, or maybe understand when the arguments that are being made are absolute nonsense, only if you're able to understand the quantitative shape of long-run economic growth. For example, Barry Eichengreen in the office next door, teaching Econ 115 this kind of semester. Someone who I haven't, it's really odd, right? So the office next door to Barry, you'd think I would see a lot of him, but I've seen him, I guess, for only half an hour in the past, well, no, I've seen him for 2 hours in the past week, but for only half an hour I've been talking to him. The rest of the time we've both been in an audience. Of course, the strangest thing is I'm going to see him be in the same room with him and be talking to him for probably 3 hours this weekend in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and have exchanged a whole bunch of emails from him this week. Anyway, puzzle of social networks in the 21st century. Barry's most recent point is that we should forecast a stop to Chinese economic growth. Not that Chinese economic growth is going to slow to zero, but it's going to slow down a lot, and it's likely to slow down a lot suddenly and pretty soon. That's an argument Barry's making. There also are the arguments about federal budgeting. One question on the table right now is we are facing enormous potential federal deficits come 2040. The big reason is the way that Lyndon Johnson structured Medicare and Medicaid. By which he said that Medicare is a program by which the federal government will pay for you if you're old, because old people find it virtually impossible to buy insurance. An insurance company looks at you and says, you're old. We'll charge you a fortune if you want insurance. You're probably sick. And then old people look at the insurance cost and say, God, I can't afford that. I'm not going to buy insurance. And so the only people who try to buy insurance are those who are really sick. And if you try and have a population of really sick people trying to buy insurance, well, the insurance company will go bankrupt if it sells it to them. So back in the 1960s and before, it was next to impossible to buy health insurance if you were an old person in America, which meant that if you got expensively sick, you had two choices. Choice one was die. Choice two was let the hospital system eat all your family's assets and bankrupt them. Something that's still